Olá, boa noite, seja bem-vindo ao segundo episódio de Pertinente, nova série da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos dedicada a grandes entrevistas com personalidades da política, economia e sociedade. Hoje temos uma grande conversa certamente fascinante com Mariana Mazzucato, economista mundialmente reconhecida como uma líder na matéria. Lançou agora mais um livro, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, onde fala na necessidade do capitalismo evoluir, trabalhar melhor com o setor privado para atingirem objetivos. Iremos também fazer uma pergunta bastante pertinente ou impertinente, que é: terá o capitalismo os dias contados? Estará condenado? A Mariana, além de ser professora, escritora, trabalha também com vários líderes de vários países, organizações internacionais também. Felizmente, arranjou um bocadinho de tempo para falar aqui conosco. Mariana, welcome.
Thank you.
I just gave a little bit of background on your professional achievements, and keyword there is little, because if not, we'd go on for quite a while. Congratulations on your career. Plus, you have 4 kids, which to me seems absolutely crazy what you've been able to accomplish. But
not on purpose. It wasn't on purpose. I don't know. It happened.
Right. I won't get into family planning. That won't be one of the topics of the conversation. I do hope that everybody is doing well. I know that you have had to deal with COVID in your household, but I hope everybody's okay now. And that's actually my first topic. Has to be is the pandemic, COVID, and the way in which your opinion it really brought to light some of the weaknesses that exist in the public sector, the way it deals with the private sector. If you were going to look at the main powers of the Western world and try to give them a grade for how well they dealt with this pandemic, would it be possible to pick one?
To pick a grade or to pick a country with a good grade? Well, I mean, to be honest, I think we have failed miserably as a planet in terms really of having not invested enough in the social fabric, including our health systems, which would have made this pandemic easier in many ways. You know, this idea of essential workers, I don't know what you call them in Portugal, but some people call them, you know, the valued workers, the essential workers, the key workers. Well, we didn't value these key workers. We didn't understand how essential that work and those structures, again, the global health system was. So had this pandemic begun in Africa, which has much weaker health systems, and in China, we would all globally be worse off. So we are only as healthy as our neighbor and our street and our city and our nation and globally. And I really hope that that's going to be the first big lesson. We need to revitalize, reimagine, and modernize and innovate within our welfare state. That isn't really a fashionable word, by the way. You know, people talk about innovation, they talk sometimes about care and why we need to bring that concept into GDP. But the concept of the welfare state is often seen as an old-fashioned idea, and that we need to somehow modernize and have more flexible states. Well, no, we need proper public health. We need proper public education so that the digital divide for all these children and students of different ages who've been locked in their homes and have frankly had very different access to their human right, you know, as one of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, to education, has been very different depending on their social and economic background, because we haven't managed to democratize and to socialize the benefits of the IT revolution. But the other thing is, you know, COVID presented so many challenges on things to do together between the state, the private sector, of course, also charities. Your own philanthropy, I'm sure, is involved in different areas. And I think this really has to be an opportunity to know how to work better together. Even the vaccine, of course, is the outcome of investment in both the state and the private sector. But if we don't govern it for the public good and the common good, then we end up with, you know, what Dr. Tedros and the World Health Organization calls vaccine apartheid. We also end up mismanaging, say, the intellectual property rights, so we don't get that collective intelligence we need. So whether it's the vaccine, the personal protection equipment, which again, we failed to really get to frontline workers in time, whether it's the test and trace system, which had to be rolled out properly and didn't in so many different countries, these are all hopefully going to be experiments and case studies. Think of how Harvard does case studies within the business sector. We need case studies within the public sector to understand how next time we're going to do it better. And it's not going to happen unless we really examine the how. And also, it's so interesting how if you look globally, some countries like Vietnam or the region of Kerala in India just did so much better than some countries like the United Kingdom, where I'm standing now. And that's not a coincidence. It's not because there was just some great leader. It was also on the back of decades of investment within the public administration, often learning the lesson of previous crises. So, for example, in Kerala, they had the Nipah virus outbreak, and that really led to new thinking of what it meant for public and private to work together well and dynamically, and also create citizen trust, which we know is very important now with the vaccine take-up. But that was, that took years to develop, and that's really the machinery of government that was also complemented in the case of Kerala, also with different self-help groups. Also in Vietnam, they really, I think in recent years, have thought a lot about what it means to bring together academia, the army, the private sector, the civil service around common purpose areas. And really, like what they ended up doing was, even though they're a small developing country, they were able to strategically use health, research and development and procurement to crowd in different innovative solutions in a way that was much more dynamic than we saw in some parts of the West.
There's so much there, and I'm going to try to pick at some of it. When you talk about examples of smaller countries and smaller states being able to deal with it better than the traditional superpowers, so to speak, and we don't have to imagine a next time, because all we have to do is think about the next wave, right? Because unfortunately waves keep coming. So let's imagine that the third wave or fourth wave is coming. We know it's coming, and you get the leader of a superpower calling you, Mariana, the wave is coming. We've started the vaccines, but they're not being processed fast enough. We need a system in place here. We have a little bit of time. How would you advise that leader in order to be ready for that wave as concretely as possible? Because also, how do you also get people to listen to the state more, which is also a problem in capitalist societies as well, where people kind of tend to tune the state out many times?
Yes, I mean, that question of trust, right? To trust what public leaders are saying, but also public systems, to trust your public health system, again, coming back to the previous point, that matters a lot. And unfortunately, that cannot just happen from waving the wand. Trust develops from relationships, from experience, from also being willing to admit when you make a mistake. I don't trust people when they don't, admit they've done something wrong. I don't mind if someone does something wrong, but if you don't even admit that you've done it wrong, and hence you've also changed your mind, ideally, then that creates a sense of distrust. And that's the first thing. I'm seeing this today really in the UK, where even though we might be having some success with the vaccine, there was lots and lots of mistakes that were committed over the last year. We have one of the highest death tolls in the world in terms of per capita, and we have to reflect on those failures. You won't learn how to ride a bicycle unless you fall off and then learn how to, to do that properly. And this is one of the big problems in the civil service globally, is that whereas, the private sector sometimes even brags about making mistakes, the venture capitalists will brag about the risk taking. As soon as a civil servant makes a mistake, they're on the front page of the newspaper. So this isn't just about countries, not admitting their mistakes, but do we actually have the culture within our public service, within our governments, that welcomes, risk-taking, experimentation, innovation, but also in doing that will make some mistakes. And do they then learn from those mistakes? And the only way to learn is if you're also investing within your organization and your capacity to learn, right? Learning doesn't just come from DNA. You have to learn. Anyway, so my first recommendation really would be precisely this. Let's please learn from what went wrong. And it's not a blame game. But again, coming back to the experience I've seen in the country where I live, here in the UK, we rolled out the test and trace system with consulting companies, in particular with Deloitte. That didn't work too well. There wasn't necessarily capacity, understanding, a history of that sort of, need within, a big global, I'm sure, very able, but consulting company. When we rolled out the vaccine, it was nested within our public health service. It was done at the community level. There was lots of knowledge and, again, trusted relationships. So the first, I think, recommendation is don't forget that, these actions aren't neutral. It's not just about getting the vaccine out there or, test and tracing. We need to nest these activities within structures. And what have we learned about those structures, whether it's learning from, what happens when you overly depend on consulting companies? What happens when you haven't invested enough in your health system? Or what happens when your health system has become too centralized and no longer has that decentralized community focus, which again is really important to have that community relationship with citizens who then trust their GPs. They're part of a practice, GP practice, again, whatever it may be called internationally. These are all really important experiences, but also, money. Things aren't free. We need to be investing and resourcing and innovating within these structures that are needed. And what's incredible is that it takes a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis or a health crisis, for leaders to say what Mario Draghi said after the financial crisis, which is, we're going to do whatever it takes, which is, again, I think what lots of global leaders are doing. But why do you have to wait for the crisis? Why do you have to wait for so many people to die or the whole financial system to almost break down as it did over 10 years ago to say, we're going to do whatever it takes? And of course, we do whatever it takes when we go to war. Have you ever heard any country say, oh, sorry, we don't have money. We're not going to go fight in Afghanistan. We're not going to go fight World War II. There's just not enough tax revenue. Sorry, we can't go. Of course not. They create the money, right? Money does get created. And, we can go here into, theories about money creation, but obviously Europe as a bloc, has a European Central Bank. And in fact, that's what Mario Draghi rolled out for us during the financial crisis. But I definitely, again, see this in the UK. We were talking about austerity for a decade. Then all of a sudden the crisis comes and we're pouring, trillions into the system. The US stimulus bill now 1.9 trillion. After just some months ago, they were fighting over pennies. So really what we need to do, and again, wake up, and this would be another big message to global leaders, is treat as urgent and as almost a security risk, as you do when you go to war, our social problems around inequality, which in some ways can be seen as having really fueled the depth of the crisis. It's made it much, much worse than it had to be. People of lower social and economic backgrounds are experiencing this crisis, and also BAME communities, this has been documented, much worse than other communities. So treat the problem of inequality, treat the problem of climate change, which is of course linked with this health crisis. If you look at what apparently is also going to happen, you were talking about new waves, it's also new viruses once the permafrost starts to melt. Apparently lots of new viruses are going to come out. Treat that as urgent now. Don't wait, as Greta tells us, when your house is burning down, you get the hell out. Don't wait till it's burning down. Create a stronger foundation now. And that issue of kind of what I call in my new book, I call it outcomes-based budgeting. First, think of the outcome. What are we trying to do? Whether it's having a carbon neutral city, fighting knife crime in a city or inner city inequality, strengthening our health system, and then backtrack about the money. What does that mean for the financing? Not just the quantity of money, but the quality and the structure in terms of literally public procurement financing, public-private partnerships, how they work together. What does it mean for sources of, say, public funds, which are increasingly out there in the global discussion? Public wealth funds or public banks also providing that patient long-term finance instead of the short-term kind of exit-driven finance that we see in the financial sector. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on. I see you're trying to say something.
I tried to come in with different. I tried to come in with different questions at different times. So I'm going to try to wrap them up in one, if that makes sense. But you have talked extensively about the over-reliance of the public sector on consultants and hiring external companies to support any kind of problem they have to fix. Let's try to be as pragmatic as possible and look at the public sector. And you can disagree with me, of course, if you want. But public sector many times traditionally has focused on a process-based decision-making circuit many times, while the private sector has focused on the product. How do you get the state to think more like a business, and you've talked about that before, so then it can be equipped to deal with things themselves. Is it a problem of resources? Is it a problem of skills? Is it a problem of confidence in its own capacity to deal with this, rather than, you know, run around with like a chicken with their head cut off, thinking, oh no, I need to fix this problem, who am I going to hire, rather than calmly say, okay, there's something coming, we have the resources, we have the people, we have the confidence, we can work with the external experts, but we want to lead this as well.
Right, so you've just touched on so many important points. So the first is, in both the recent book and the previous books, I tackle this problem, which is how we even understand government. So there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We end up with the wrong government because we've actually thought about government in, let me just say it, the wrong way. At best, we talk about the role of government as fixing things when they go wrong. In economics, we try to sound really smart, so we say fixing market failures. And there's a whole theory of markets and how they work, and sometimes they fail due to all sorts of conditions, whether it's positive externalities, like when you have the benefits of something that the private sector doesn't invest in, because the spillovers are so great, they can't appropriate the returns just to themselves. We call those public goods. Whether it's negative externalities like pollution, and we want government to come in with something like a carbon tax. Whether it's a market failure like asymmetric information, so you need government to come in and help small companies, and so on and so on. So it's not that those market failures don't exist. The problem is that if you are there just to put patches in the system, literally Band-Aids, or fill the gap of something the private sector is not doing, you will always be too little, too late. Your point about the chickens with their heads cut off, right? And also, if you're just a market fixer, there's no reason to invest within your organization to see yourself as a creator of value, a co-creator of value. You're not there just to de-risk the risk takers or enable the wealth creators somewhere in this mythological world of entrepreneurship. You are there to co-create value, to co-shape the economy alongside, of course, business. This is always about public and private. I'm just bashing away at why we've gotten the public bit wrong, but of course it has to be public and private. And the problem with the consulting companies or the outsourcing or the privatization, it's not that you don't want to outsource. Some things you should outsource. And of course, you should always be working with business. But the question is, what are you outsourcing? You know, if you stop actually investing within your own brain and you start outsourcing your brain, which helps you manage crises, but also understand the world around you, you're going to have a problem. You're going to end up being a bit, dare I say, stupid. So eventually you will have to, either outsource or privatize or give to the private sector activities, not because you actually think it's best done in the private sector, just because you don't have a clue what you're doing. And so, this is one of the reasons I've actually set up a whole institute in London called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where we're trying to rewrite the curriculum, change the mindset literally of the public service, global bureaucrats. So even the word bureaucratic shouldn't be a bad word. Why is it a bad word? I'm sure you've used it. I use it all the time. Yeah. Like, oh my God, that's so bureaucratic. Well, why is that negative? The problem is we have the wrong bureaucracies. We have inertial, static, top-down. They're not dynamic bureaucracies. They're static bureaucracies. So what does it mean to create a creative bureaucracy? And when you said before that I say government should work like business, well, please no. Business has huge amounts of problems. Half my book is on the problems business is facing. True. Business is often too short-termist. $4 trillion have been spent by the S&P 500 companies just on buying back their shares to boost their stock prices, stock options and executive pay. That value extraction out of the economy is hugely problematic, and I won't go into it now. But, that short-termism and speculativeness and just worried about the bottom line is not what you need governments to do. But you do need them, and businesses too, need to be more long-termist, but also really rethink within the public sector, what do we even mean by public value? Something, by the way, that the BBC thinks about that a lot. They have this concept of public value, which they need to, talk about anytime they decide to do something. But, public purpose, or we can, maybe come on to the idea in the book about missions. What is a public sector mission? Well, a public sector mission, first of all, must be addressing what society needs, A. Who decides what society needs, ideally, will also be democratically decided. It's not just a top-down idea by some bureaucrat, again, or minister who says, this is good for you. Ideally, that will come out of a contestation that we have through our democratic fora. For example, citizen assemblies are increasingly important. But also, it really should involve as many different actors in the economy. You don't want governments just picking, one thing to do, like, oh, let's do offshore wind and put all our eggs in that basket. What you want governments to do is decide on something as bold as, say, a green transition, to have a carbon neutral, welfare state. This is something that Sweden is talking about. And then getting as many different sectors, nutrition, transport, artificial intelligence, behavioral changes, of course, need to happen. But, going to the moon was not just aeronautics. There was lots of investments in innovation in sectors like materials, electronics, software, again, nutrition. And because government was so confident, a word you used before, and quite bold, it wasn't just the space race, Sputnik, it was getting to the moon and back again in one generation. That's what they set themselves. They really paid attention to what was needed to get there. And they were very outcomes focused, but in interacting with business, I'm talking about NASA here, they kept it quite open in terms of how business did what it needed to do. Otherwise, it would be micromanaged, that would kill innovation. But they were very bold in the procurement contracts, for example. They even thought about things like, how are we going to make sure that this doesn't just become a gambling casino? So they inserted in the procurement clauses things like no excess profits. If this is on the back of huge public sector investments, and of course we need business investment as well, you can't just be taking all the rewards yourself. There's going to be some sort of sharing in whatever way. It depended obviously in what they were talking about, but they also made sure that the contracts weren't going to lead to too much cost inflation. So they moved their contracts from being cost plus contracts to being fixed price contracts with continual incentives for innovation and quality improvements, just to say that they cared about the details. It wasn't the old dogma, is it state, is it private sector? It was definitely together, but together in a symbiotic way, not a parasitic way.
Let's take a look at a specific mission, Mariana, like climate change, like reaching concrete goals that allow this planet to be sustainable, and looking at the model that you like to explore and the symbiotic way of state and private sector of working together. Concretely, how can that be done now for there to be a common good and reach those expectations and goals that are going to allow this race to survive? Because you mentioned short-termism as well, and that is such a big problem of the way that both sectors operate, where the politicians many times need to guarantee they're re-elected. The companies need to guarantee that they get profits for shareholders, and at the same time they ignore the greater common good goals, right? So how do you do that in order to reach such a concrete objective like avoiding climate change and reaching certain goals with carbon emissions, and do it in a capitalist society mainly? Yeah.
So, first of all, with climate change in particular, it really needs to go to the center of everything. It can't just be a little hobby on the side, that you keep business as normal in terms of how treasuries, for example, operate, and then you put climate change just in the Department of Energy or Environment or whatever a country might have in terms of their ministries. I think climate change needs to go to the center of how we think about the economy. The economy has not just a rate, but a direction. Innovation has not just a rate, but a direction. So how do we direct our economy towards, sustainability targets, towards carbon neutrality, and so on? The first thing is it has to go to the center of the economy. And it also has to go to the center of the economy, how we think of working together. So this concept, for example, of stakeholder value, which the Davos kind of World Economic Forum, jet set conversations always talk about, that can't just be about corporate governance, moving away from just maximizing shareholder value towards maximizing stakeholder value. That concept needs to go to the center of how public and private actually work together. So things like conditionalities tied to grants, loans, procurement, bailout, recovery schemes, that these aren't just government handouts, subsidies, guarantees. In my country, in Italy, there's all these subsidies and guarantees, which then create this kind of very static public-private relationship. Putting conditionalities in the middle means putting stakeholder value at the center of public-private relationships. And I think that's really, really essential. So this is about doing capitalism, not socialism, capitalism in a different way with stakeholder value at the center. Let me just give you a really concrete example about how this was happening in some countries before COVID. I think actually COVID has elevated some of this, the importance about this because of the recovery funds. Huge amounts of money going into the system. It's going to be wasted unless we really build back better. But before COVID, I think a couple years before COVID struck, the steel industry in Germany was really experiencing lots of problems like it's experiencing everywhere, and asked the government for a loan. I know this happened both in Italy and the UK, I don't know, in Portugal. And unlike in the UK and in Italy, where the government just said, oh God, steel is in trouble, let's give them some money so they, survive. They said, okay, you need, help. Yes, we recognize that. You have a huge problem in all sorts of ways. But you know what? We have a strategy in this country called Energiewende. And they wanted to transform their entire manufacturing basis towards a green direction. So they said, in order to access this loan, you will have to commit to reducing your material content across your entire value chain in order for your carbon emissions to fall. And they were forced to do that, not so much with a stick, but with the carrot of receiving a big public loan. And they did it. They did it by innovating and investing across, again, the whole value chain through techniques around repurpose, reuse, recycle, not because they went to Davos and said, we need to be more purpose-oriented, but they had to in order to, again, access the loan. With COVID, what's interesting is, similarly, huge amounts of money being poured into the system, too last minute, as we were saying before. But in some countries, like in France, you've had pretty bold statements made, for example, by President Macron, who said, we're not here just to bail out business, but to help transform it, right? So the Build Back Better idea. So they put conditions on both the airlines and the automobile producers to, again, commit to reducing their carbon emissions. In Austria and Denmark, they put conditions around stop evading your tax. Or you know what? If you want to, fine, but you're not getting a penny of public money, of public recovery funds. It's not rocket science, is it? But this idea of conditionality, the problem is the word. It sounds too much like the Washington Consensus days of, conditions around austerity, of, cutting public budgets. I think it has to be about the social contract. And this is how you work better. It also comes back to the trusted relationship. It's not just trust with citizens, but trust between these different value-creating, public-private actors. It's hard to actually respect another organization from the business side if you think you're just going to always get subsidies. You'll just ask for them, but you don't actually really respect, the civil servant giving it to you because you don't see yourself as collaborating on something together. So it's not just about, investing in innovation. It's also about building a better relationship, almost like marriage counseling. Therapy. We need therapy.
That's a good way. That's a good way of putting it. I'm a big advocate for therapy. I have a couple. Time is running out. I have a couple of final quick-fire questions for you, in a sentence or two. First
therapy,
won't be easy. No, it won't be easy. But current model of capitalism, does it have its days numbered? Yes or no? And in one sentence, what's the first step to fixing it?
Yes, for sure. And we have no choice. And the first step, without repeating everything I just said, is understand where it's gone wrong, but then get your hands dirty in doing it better. Let's start with the small. Let's start with the vaccine. Let's get these contracts right. Let's get what the World Health Organization calls a patent pool to nurture collective intelligence and not just profiteering. If we can do it around the vaccine, scale it up, do it across the whole health sector, and so on.
What is the biggest challenge that humanity faces in the next decade?
Climate change, for sure. That's, if we don't solve that, there's nothing to talk about.
And you work with many policy leaders and some of the world's greatest leaders. What's one trait that a good leader needs to have to be successful?
Empathy. And by that, I don't mean sympathy. I mean actually listening and putting yourself in other people's shoes. So the just transition, for example, coming back to climate change, that's about workers and all the people, the workers in different areas that will potentially be left behind if we, move away from coal towards renewable systems. And what does it mean for trade unions to be at the table, not just ex post fighting for a just transition, but ex ante talking and being listened to with global policymakers? And I would say this also of citizen groups, actually really being listened to in order to design the missions themselves together in a co-creation, collaborative, co-design way. You need skills to do that. it's not something you just say, okay, everyone come in the room, let's talk. You need to be trained in how to listen and work collaboratively, and then, get your hands dirty and go do it. But if you're not listening, it's always going to be wrong because it's not really going to be an outcome of what's needed.
Mariana, it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to speak with you here. All the best. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And once again, I love your passion. I love how much you feel what you say, and that also comes across in your writing. And once again, recalling for everybody watching us the name of your last book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. All the best. And
thank you.
Hope to see and hear you soon, if not personally online. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much.
As palavras de Mariana Mazzucato, uma conversa muito interessante sobre a forma como alguns dos governos não souberam lidar da melhor forma com o início da pandemia. Mariana aqui a apontar o dedo a alguns desses mesmos líderes e a necessidade de se trabalhar melhor entre o setor privado e público para atingir objetivos em comum. Também, obviamente, a missão número 1 neste momento para todos deveria ser como salvar o planeta. Fechamos aqui então o segundo episódio de Impertinente e já sabe, quando há factos, há argumentos.